In the previous part, we have finished the save load and reset functionality. So now we can play our game, and only one feature that haven't implemented yet is the Autoclicker. So now let's implement the Autoclicker. At first, let's think what Autoclicker should do. In the description of this feature, I wrote that Autoclicker earns poopy currency every second based on your best pet level. Under our currency counter, we have the counter for the best pet level on the board. So currently, the best level that I have is the first one, so it means that Autoclicker should click any of the first level pet each second. For example, if I merge these animals, now you see that I have an animal of the second level, so it means that our Autoclicker should click this animal every second. In our code, let's go through each section and let's think what we need to add. The first section is the game data. We already stored the best level, so let's return to this section later. The next section is HTML elements, and here we can access our Autoclicker button. So let's go to the HTML to find the ID of this button. In the index.html, I see that we have a button with the label enabled for 16 poopy currency. So this is the button that we have on our page, and the ID of this button is auto button. So let's copy this ID, and now let's paste it inside of the get element by ID method. So now let's go to the next section. In the helper section, I see the increase poop function, and we even can pass the reward directly to this function. So we can use this function for our Autoclicker. And now let's go directly to the trigger section, and here let's add a new trigger. So for example here, I can add the event listener that will call our increase poop function on the click. Now let's test how it works. If I click the enable button, you will see that nothing happens, and this is because increase poop function expects one parameter. So for passing this parameter, we put the parenthesis, but parenthesis executes this function immediately. So actually it means that we need to use the anonymous function to pass our increase poop as a variable. So now let's test it again. I can click the Autoclicker, and now you see that our currency counter increases by 1. But actually we want to enable this Autoclicker, and then we want to set interval that will click our pets automatically each second. So at first, let's expand our anonymous function. So for that, I need to add curly braces, and then I can expand them. And now I can write multiple lines inside of this anonymous function. So at first, inside of the increase poop function, we pass the hard-coded value 1, but actually we want to pass the reward of the best level animal. If you go to the game data section, you'll find that we store the best level, but actually the best level is not always equal to the reward. As you see in our constant pets, we have two different columns, one for the level and one for the reward, and they are not always equal to each other. So let's write a small helper function that will find the reward based on the best level. So inside of the helper section, right after the reset indexes, let's write a new function. So I call this function getBestReward, and now we need to get this reward from the pets constant. So at first we need to find the index of the animal that we want to access. If you look to the pets constant, you will find that our levels are from 1 to 10, so they are 1 based. But actually we store them inside of the array, which is a 0 based. So it means that the pet index is equal to the level of this pet minus 1. And now we can find the animal by using this index. So this code will give us a pet object, so let's store it inside of the pet variable. And now you see that inside of this object, we have the reward. So let's access it. And now we can return the reward. Let's use this function instead of the hard-coded value 1. So inside of the trigger section, I call the getBestReward function. Now let's test how it works. The best level on the map is 1, and if I click the Autoclicker, you see that my counter increases by 1. Now I have the animal of the second level, so this animal has the reward 2, and if I click our Autoclicker, you see that our counter increases by 2. So it means that our function works correctly, but we still don't have our Autoclicker. Currently we need to click this button manually. Let's add the interval that will increase poop each second. For that, I have the function setInterval. This function expects two parameters. So the first parameter is the function that we want to call. So in our case, we want to call increasePoop function. So let's put it inside of the setInterval. And the second parameter is the amount of seconds, how often we should call this function. So we want to call it after each second. But this function expects milliseconds, so I can write 1000 milliseconds. And now let's test how it works. If I click the enable button, you will see that we again increased our counter by 1, but then our autoclicker doesn't work. And this is because we wrote increasePoop function with parentheses. So again, this function executes immediately, but actually we need to pass this function as a variable. So for that, let's wrap it inside of the anonymous function. And now let's test how it works. If I click the Autoclicker, now you see that our currency counter increases by 1 each second. Let's buy a new animal and let's merge them. Now I have the animal of the second level and you see that our counter increases by 2. So it means that our function works correctly. Actually, we have one severe problem. We can click our enable button several times. And now you will see that our counter increases much faster because each time when you click this button, you add a new interval. So we want to prevent this behavior, and for that, let's check that if we already have our set interval, it means that we need to do nothing. For validating do we have the set interval or not, we need to add a new global variable. Let's add a new variable autoclick enabled. This will be a boolean and initially it will be equal to false. So it means that our autoclicker is not enabled. Now let's return back to our trigger and here let's check that if our autoclicker is enabled, it means that we need to do nothing. So we can finish this function. For that we can write if autoclicker enabled and only if this value is equal to true, we will go to the body of this if statement and we will call the return keyword. So return keyword will finish our function. But now we need to enable our autoclicker. At this point, I know that our autoclicker enabled is equal to false. So let's set it to true. Now we can test how it works. I click the autoclicker button and now we see that autoclicker is enabled. And if I click several times, nothing happens. We still see that our counter increases with the same speed. Actually, our autoclicker has a cost, which is 60 Poopy currency. Let's also validate that our player has enough currency. So before we enable our autoclicker, let's add a small validation. So I check that if the currency counter is less than 60, it means that our user doesn't have enough resources. So I show the message that you don't have enough poop and then I finish this function. But if our user has enough currency, let's update our counter. Also, let's update the label so our user will see that the autoclicker is enabled. So I changed the text content of the autoclicker button and now let's test how it works. If I click the autoclicker, you see that our button changes the label to the enabled and now you see that our autoclicker works. I can't buy more than one autoclicker, but we also need to think about our save, load and reset buttons. So currently, when I save our game, I don't save the state of our autoclicker. So let's test how it works. At first, I save our game. And then I load the game. In this case, our autoclicker is still enabled, but if we refresh the page and then load our game, you will see that our autoclicker doesn't work anymore. Let's save our autoclicker enabled variable. Inside of the save function, I will add a new key value pair. And now let's go to our load function, and here let's also update our global variable. Now let's test how it works. At first, I buy our autoclicker. Now let's save this game. Then I refresh the page. And now I load our game again. And as you see, nothing happens. And this is because when we refresh the page, all the intervals that we had on our page disappear. So this is just how the refresh button works. So it means that we can just store our variable. We also need to start a new interval. For that, let's copy these 3 lines. And now inside of the load function, after we updated our global variables, let's start the autoclicker. Now let's test how it works. I buy a new Autoclicker, then I refresh the page, and then I load the Autoclicker again. And now you see that our Autoclicker is enabled and we again earn our currency. But now we still have several problems. Currently, I start a new game. Now let's save a game without the Autoclicker. And then let's load our game. You'll see that our Autoclicker enabled, and this is because in the load function, I don't check the Autoclicker enabled variable. So let's wrap these 3 lines inside of the if statement. Now it means that I will set a new interval only if the Autoclicker enabled is equal to true. Also, I can remove this line because we already have checked that this variable is equal to true. But we still have one severe bug. Let's start the Autoclicker. Then let's save it, and now let's load our game several times. Now you see that our counter increases much faster than once per second, and this is because every time when we call the setInterval function, we create a new interval on top of the previous one. So all the time when you create a new interval, you must think where you clear this interval. Currently, the only one way how we remove our intervals is the refresh button, but I want to show you a proper way how you need to finish your intervals. For that, you have a function clearInterval which expects one parameter. This is ID, and the type of this ID is number or undefined. So this is the ID of the previous interval that we want to stop. When we call our interval, we actually can store the value of this interval inside of the variable ID. And then we can pass this variable inside of the function clearInterval. And this is because every time when we create a new interval, this function returns a unique ID that we can use for the clear interval. So actually, we don't want to call our clear interval right after the set interval, because it means that we start our interval and then we finish it in the same function. So for implementing this logic, let's create a new global variable autoInterval ID, and then let's write 2 functions: start Autoclicker interval and stop Autoclicker interval. Instead of declaring the autoInterval ID inside of the trigger, let's declare it inside of the game data section. So the initial value of the autoInterval ID is null, and let's also change the const keyword to the let. So now we can reassign this variable. So let's copy it and paste inside of our trigger. Now I reassign our autoInterval ID after I call our interval. Then let's remove our clearInterval function. And now let's write the function start Autoclicker interval. So inside of the helper section, after the getBestReward function, let's write this function. We will not pass anything inside of this function because we store the data about the intervals inside of the global variables. Now let's copy this line from the triggers and let's paste it inside of the start autoInterval. We will also use this function when we load our game. Here we also can write a small validation that if our autoInterval ID is not equal to null, we need to return our function. Now I'm sure that autoInterval ID creates a new interval only if this variable is equal to null. And then let's write a new function stop autoInterval. And here let's clear our interval using the autoInterval ID. Also, we have the second global variable, which is Autoclicker is enabled. So inside of the start Autoclicker, let's set this variable to true. And inside of the stop autoInterval, let's set it to false. Also, when we start a new interval, we want to change the label of the enable button. So let's add it inside of the start autoInterval. And now let's go to our trigger section. So here, instead of these 3 lines, we can use the start autoInterval function. And now let's go to the load function. So here, at first we need to stop the previous interval. I call the stop autoInterval function, and I don't even need to add any validation, because if the setInterval ID is equal to null, our stop autoInterval will do nothing. And then inside of the if statement, let's call the start Autoclicker function. And now let's test how it works. I enable a new Autoclicker, then I save this game, and then I load this game again. Now you see that our Autoclicker doesn't work, and this is because in the stop auto interval, we reassign our Autoclicker enable to false. And then I check that if this is equal to true, I start a new auto interval. So actually, inside of the stop auto interval, I shouldn't change the Autoclicker enabled. Instead of it, I can reassign auto interval ID to null. So now, if you test how it works, you will see that everything works as expected. My congratulations, you have finished this game. There is still a lot of space for the improvements, so if you want, you can improve this game your own. But we will learn a new theory, and after that, we will work on a new project. So in the next video, we will learn about errors in JavaScript.